The morning sun cast long shadows across Wall Street as Marcus Wellington adjusted his Italian silk tie, stepping out of his black Bentley onto the bustling sidewalk. At 42, he had everything a man could desire: a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a portfolio worth hundreds of millions, and the respect that came with being one of New York's most ruthless investment bankers. His Armani suit, worth more than most people's monthly salary, moved with practiced precision as he navigated through the crowd of morning commuters, each step calculated, each glance dismissive of those he deemed beneath his status. Marcus had built his empire on a simple philosophy. Weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford, and compassion was a distraction from success. Growing up in poverty in Detroit, he had clawed his way out of the gutter through sheer determination and an iron will that crushed anyone who stood in his way. Every rejection, every humiliation from his childhood had been fuel for his relentless climb to the top. Now, surrounded by luxury and power, he had no patience for those who hadn't fought as hard as he had to escape their circumstances. The sidewalk buzzed with the familiar symphony of urban life: honking cars, chattering pedestrians, and the distant hum of construction. Marcus moved through it all like a shark through water, his cold blue eyes focused solely on the towering glass building that housed Wellington and Associates. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from clients, each conversation potentially worth millions. He had learned long ago to shut out distractions, to ignore the homeless people who lined the streets, the street vendors calling out their wares, and especially the children who sometimes approached with outstretched hands. As he rounded the corner onto Fifth Avenue, Marcus noticed a small figure huddled against the brick wall of an old bookstore. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, sat cross-legged on a piece of cardboard, her dark hair tangled and her clothes several sizes too big. Her brown eyes, large and expressive despite the dirt smudged across her cheeks, followed the stream of well-dressed pedestrians who hurried past without so much as a glance in her direction. In her small hands, she held a crumpled paper cup, hoping for the kindness of strangers who seemed to look right through her. Marcus's jaw tightened as he approached. He had seen countless children like this one during his morning walks, and they all represented the same thing to him: a reminder of weakness, of people who had given up the fight. His own childhood had been just as harsh, perhaps harsher, but he had refused to beg, refused to depend on the pity of others. This girl, sitting there with her sad eyes and silent plea for help, embodied everything he had fought to leave behind. She was a ghost from his past, a mirror he didn't want to look into. The girl looked up as a shadow fell across her makeshift seat. For a moment, their eyes met, and something flickered in her gaze. Not just hope for a few coins, but recognition of something deeper. She seemed to see past his expensive exterior to something underneath, something he had buried long ago. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply held up her cup, a gesture so small and vulnerable that it might have moved a different man to reach for his wallet. But Marcus Wellington was not a different man. His expression hardened into the same mask of indifference he wore in boardrooms when crushing competitors or firing employees. Without breaking stride, he stepped around her, as if she were nothing more than an obstacle on his path. He didn't see the way her shoulders sagged slightly, or how her eyes followed him with a mixture of disappointment and something else, something that looked almost like understanding. To him, she was invisible, irrelevant, just another casualty of a world that rewarded only the strong. The interaction, brief as it was, should have ended there. Marcus continued his walk toward his office building, his mind already shifting to the day's first meeting with potential investors from Tokyo. But something nagged at him, a persistent itch in the back of his consciousness that he couldn't quite shake. Perhaps it was the way the girl had looked at him, not with the desperate pleading he was accustomed to seeing from panhandlers, but with a quiet dignity that reminded him uncomfortably of someone else. Someone from a time he preferred to forget. His mother, Sarah Wellington, had possessed that same look during their final months together in that cramped Detroit apartment. Even as cancer ravaged her body and medical bills consumed what little money they had, she had maintained a grace and strength that Marcus, at 16, had found both inspiring and infuriating. She had never begged, never complained. Even when the electricity was cut off and they huddled together under thin blankets during the harsh Michigan winter. Instead, she had looked at him with eyes full of love and unwavering faith that somehow things would get better. Marcus shook his head violently, dispelling the unwanted memory as he pushed through the revolving doors of his building. The marble lobby, with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, immediately restored his sense of superiority and control. This was his world now, a world of power lunches and million-dollar deals, where weakness was extinct and sentiment was a luxury he had long since abandoned. The security guard nodded respectfully as Marcus strode toward the elevator bank, his Berluti shoes clicking authoritatively against the polished floor. But even as the elevator whisked him toward the 40th floor, the image of the little girl lingered. There had been something in her eyes, something that transcended the usual desperation he associated with street beggars. It was as if she had seen straight through his carefully constructed armor to the frightened boy he had once been, the boy who had watched his mother slip away while he stood helpless, unable to afford the treatments that might have saved her life. The elevator doors opened to reveal his secretary, Patricia, a stern woman in her 50s who had worked for Marcus for over a decade. She handed him his morning coffee, black, no sugar, exactly as he preferred, and began rattling off his schedule for the day. Board meeting at 9, lunch with the Yamamoto Corporation at 12:30, conference call with London at 3. Each appointment represented millions of dollars in potential revenue. Each decision could affect hundreds of jobs and countless lives. This was the responsibility that came with power, Marcus told himself. He couldn't afford to be distracted by every sob story on the street. Yet as he settled behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by awards and photographs documenting his rise to prominence, Marcus found his attention wandering to the window that overlooked the street below. From his lofty perch, the pedestrians looked like ants scurrying about their insignificant lives. Somewhere down there, he knew, the little girl was still sitting on her piece of cardboard, still hoping for a miracle that would probably never come. The thought should have meant nothing to him, but instead it gnawed at him like a splinter under his skin. His first meeting began promptly at 9, and Marcus threw himself into the familiar rhythm of negotiation and manipulation. He dissected financial reports with surgical precision, identified weaknesses in his opponent's arguments, and closed deals that would have made lesser men weep with joy. But even as he dominated the conference room with his commanding presence and razor-sharp intellect, part of his mind remained fixed on that street corner, on those dark eyes that had looked at him with such unexpected understanding. By the time his lunch meeting concluded, Marcus had successfully secured a $20 million investment from the Japanese corporation, a deal that would expand his firm's reach into Asian markets. His colleagues congratulated him, his clients praised his brilliance, and his bank account grew even more obscenely large. But as he walked back toward his office building, taking the same route he had traveled that morning, Marcus found himself slowing his pace as he approached the bookstore where the girl had been sitting. The cardboard was still there, but she was gone. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the empty piece of cardboard that fluttered slightly in the afternoon breeze. A strange hollowness opened in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Around him, the city continued its relentless pace. Business people hurried past, taxis honked impatiently, and street vendors called out to potential customers. But for Marcus, time seemed suspended in that moment of unexpected absence. He told himself it didn't matter. The girl was probably just another street kid who moved from corner to corner, following the flow of generous pedestrians and avoiding the attention of social services. Her disappearance meant nothing to him, just as her presence had meant nothing. Yet he found himself scanning the nearby doorways and alleys, his keen eyes searching for a glimpse of tangled dark hair and oversized clothes. The rational part of his mind mocked this sudden concern, reminding him that he had built his fortune by focusing only on what truly mattered: profit, power, and personal advancement. But as Marcus resumed his walk to the office, another memory surfaced unbidden from the depths of his carefully buried past. He was 7 years old again, sitting in a hospital waiting room with cracked vinyl chairs and fluorescent lights that hummed incessantly overhead. His mother lay beyond those sterile white doors, fighting a battle she was destined to lose, while he clutched a drawing he had made for her, a crayon masterpiece depicting the two of them in a house with a white picket fence and a dog named Buddy. A nurse with kind eyes had knelt beside him and gently explained that visiting hours were over, that he would have to wait until tomorrow to see his mommy again. That night, alone in their empty apartment with only the distant sounds of Detroit's troubled streets for company, Marcus had made a promise to himself. He would never again be powerless. He would never again be at the mercy of circumstances beyond his control. He would climb so high, accumulate so much wealth and influence, that no one could ever make him wait in another hospital corridor while someone he loved slipped away from him. It was a promise that had driven him through every obstacle, every setback, every moment of doubt during his ruthless ascent to the top of the financial world. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Marcus's inexplicably somber mood as he prepared for another day of conquest in the corporate jungle. His penthouse apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and museum-quality artwork, felt oddly cold despite the expensive heating system that maintained a perfect 72 degrees. He dressed with his usual meticulous attention to detail, selecting a charcoal Brioni suit, sterling silver cufflinks, and Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people earned in a month, but found himself moving through his morning routine with mechanical precision rather than his typical aggressive energy. As he stepped out of his Bentley onto the familiar sidewalk, Marcus's eyes immediately went to the corner where the girl had been sitting the day before. The cardboard was gone now, probably discarded by some well-meaning city worker or blown away by the wind, leaving no trace that she had ever been there at all. He felt a strange disappointment, followed immediately by anger at himself for caring. This was exactly the kind of emotional weakness that he had spent decades eliminating from his psyche, the sort of sentimental nonsense that would have destroyed him in the cutthroat world of high finance. But as he approached the spot where she had sat, Marcus noticed something that made his steps falter. There, wedged between the brick wall and a newspaper stand, was a small piece of folded paper. It was dirty and creased, as if it had been handled many times, and it bore no indication of what it might contain or who might have left it. Any rational person would have walked past without a second glance, dismissing it as just another piece of urban litter. But something about the deliberate way it had been placed, almost hidden yet still visible to someone who was looking, made Marcus pause. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the paper, a reaction that both surprised and disturbed him. Marcus Wellington's hands never trembled, not during hostile takeovers, not while firing longtime employees, not even during the occasional death threats from people whose lives he had inadvertently destroyed through his business dealings. Yet here he was, hesitating over a scrap of paper like a schoolboy afraid of what he might find inside a love letter. The paper felt surprisingly warm in his fingers, as if it had been recently touched by human hands. Around him, the morning rush continued its chaotic dance, but Marcus might as well have been standing in a vacuum. Every sound seemed muffled. Every movement appeared as slow to a dreamlike crawl as he carefully unfolded the mysterious note, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't experienced since his mother's final moments in that sterile hospital room all those years ago. The handwriting was childish yet surprisingly neat, formed with the careful precision of someone who had put great thought into every letter. The words were written in blue ballpoint pen, some letters slightly smudged as if tears had fallen on the paper while it was being written. Marcus had to read it twice before the full meaning penetrated the fortress of indifference he had built around his heart over the decades. "Dear Mr. in the nice suit," the note began, "my name is Elena and I am 8 years old. I wanted to tell you something yesterday, but you walked away too fast. You look like my daddy who went to heaven when I was little. Mama says he was very sad inside, even though he looked strong on the outside. She says sad people sometimes forget how to see other sad people. I'm not asking for money. I have something for you instead. Meet me at St. Mary's Church on Bleecker Street tonight at 8 if you want to know why you cry when you think no one is watching. Your friend, Elena." Marcus's hands shook violently as he read the words again, each sentence hitting him like a physical blow. How could this child possibly know about the tears he shed in the privacy of his penthouse? The moments of crushing loneliness that overtook him in the early hours of morning, when success felt as hollow as an empty tomb. How could she have seen through the armor he had forged from years of ruthless ambition and emotional isolation? Most disturbing of all, how had she known to look for those cracks in his facade when everyone else, his colleagues, his clients, even the women he occasionally dated, saw only the polished surface of his manufactured persona? The note slipped from his nerveless fingers and fluttered to the sidewalk, but Marcus barely noticed. His vision blurred as memories he had spent decades suppressing came flooding back with devastating clarity. He was 16 again, standing beside his mother's hospital bed as machines beeped their mechanical rhythm and tubes snaked across her frail body like the tendrils of some technological spider. Sarah Wellington had opened her eyes one final time, looked at her son with infinite love and sadness, and whispered words that had haunted him ever since. "Don't let the world make you forget how to love, Marcus. Promise me you won't become so strong that you forget how to be human." He had made that promise through his tears, holding her hand as it grew cold in his grasp. But he had broken it almost immediately. The funeral expenses had consumed their meager savings, leaving him homeless and alone in a city that showed no mercy to abandoned children. Social services had tried to place him in foster care, but Marcus had run away repeatedly, determined to make his own way in the world rather than depend on the charity of strangers. He had lied about his age to get a job washing dishes in a greasy downtown diner, sleeping in alleys and abandoned buildings, stealing food when necessary, and gradually building the emotional calluses that would protect him from ever feeling that vulnerable again. By the time Marcus finally bent to retrieve the note, his expensive suit jacket was damp with perspiration, and his carefully styled hair had fallen across his forehead in disheveled strands. Pedestrians flowed around him like water around a stone, their faces bearing the typical New York expression of determined indifference to whatever personal drama might be unfolding in their midst. But Marcus felt as if he were standing naked in the middle of Times Square, every secret shame and buried pain exposed for the world to see. St. Mary's Church on Bleecker Street. Marcus knew the building well, a modest Catholic church sandwiched between a vintage clothing store and an overpriced coffee shop, its Gothic facade blackened by decades of city grime, but still maintaining a quiet dignity that spoke of deeper truths than quarterly profit reports and stock market fluctuations. He had passed it countless times during his rare ventures into Greenwich Village, usually dismissing it as another relic of superstition and weakness. Now the thought of entering that sacred space filled him with a terror more profound than any hostile takeover or corporate espionage scheme he had ever faced. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls that Marcus navigated on autopilot, his body present, but his mind fixed obsessively on the child's invitation. He closed a lucrative deal with a pharmaceutical company, approved the layoffs of 200 factory workers in Ohio, and reviewed architectural plans for a new shopping complex that would displace a community garden beloved by local residents. These were the kind of decisions that had made him wealthy beyond imagination. Yet today they felt mechanical and meaningless, like moves in a chess game where he had forgotten what victory was supposed to look like. As evening approached and the Manhattan sky darkened to deep purple, Marcus found himself standing at the window of his office, staring down at the street lights that twinkled like earthbound stars. His reflection in a glass showed a man who appeared to have everything: power, wealth, respect, but whose eyes held a profound emptiness that no amount of success could fill. Elena's words echoed in his mind with increasing intensity. "You cry when you think no one is watching." How had this child seen what everyone else had missed? And what could she possibly have to give him that his millions couldn't buy? The heavy wooden doors of St. Mary's Church groaned softly as Marcus pushed them open, stepping from the neon-lit chaos of Bleecker Street into a sanctuary that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The interior was dimly lit by flickering votive candles and stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across worn stone floors, creating an atmosphere of hushed reverence that made his expensive shoes sound almost profane as they clicked against the ancient tiles. The scent of incense and old wood filled his nostrils, triggering memories so deeply buried that he had almost convinced himself they were dreams rather than experiences from his forgotten childhood. Marcus had arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, his punctuality born from decades of business meetings where every minute represented potential profit or loss. But as he stood in the empty nave, surrounded by rows of wooden pews that had witnessed countless prayers, confessions, and moments of desperate hope, he felt more lost than he had since those terrible days after his mother's death. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic and the soft whisper of his own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the sacred space. For several minutes, he wondered if this had all been some elaborate hoax, a cruel joke designed to exploit the moment of vulnerability that Elena's note had created in his carefully constructed emotional fortress. Perhaps there was no 8-year-old girl at all, just some con artist who had recognized his expensive clothing and decided to prey upon whatever weakness they imagined they had detected. The thought filled him with a familiar rage, the same cold fury that had powered his rise through the ranks of corporate predators who viewed compassion as a fatal flaw and sentiment as a luxury that only fools could afford. But then he heard it, a small sound that was barely more than a whisper, coming from the shadows near the altar. As his eyes adjusted to the candlelit gloom, Marcus could make out a tiny figure kneeling in the front pew, her head bowed in what appeared to be prayer. Elena looked even smaller in this vast space, her second hand closed clean but patched, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail that revealed a face far too serious for someone who should have been worried about nothing more complex than homework and playground games. She must have sensed his presence, because she turned slowly, her dark eyes finding his across the empty church with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. There was no surprise in her expression, no uncertainty or fear despite the fact that she was alone with a man who was essentially a stranger. Instead, she smiled with a warmth that pierced through his defenses like sunlight through storm clouds, and gestured for him to join her in the front pew with the natural authority of someone who belonged in this place in a way that he never would. Marcus approached slowly, each step feeling like a journey across an emotional minefield. Up close, Elena appeared even more fragile than she had on the street corner, but there was a strength in her bearing that reminded him uncomfortably of his mother during her final days. She had that same quality of being present in the moment, of accepting whatever circumstances life had dealt her without bitterness or complaint. It was a grace that Marcus had lost somewhere along his climb to the top, traded away for the armor of cynicism and the weapons of ambition. "You came," Elena said simply, her voice carrying none of the surprise or gratitude he might have expected. It was as if she had known with absolute certainty that he would be unable to resist her invitation, despite every logical reason to dismiss her note as the fantasy of a disturbed child. I wasn't sure you would remember how to find this place, but I guess some things stay with us, even when we try to forget them. Her words hit him like a physical blow, because they were absolutely true in a way that he couldn't explain or rationalize. Marcus had indeed remembered the way to St. Mary's, not from his adult years of passing it dismissively during business ventures into the village, but from much earlier memories that he had spent decades trying to suppress. He had been here before, long ago, in the company of someone who had believed that salvation could be found in quiet prayer and unwavering faith. The realization left him speechless, struggling to understand how this child could possibly know about chapters of his life that he had never shared with another living soul. Elena reached into a small backpack that sat beside her on the wooden pew, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were handling something precious beyond measure. From its depths, she withdrew an object wrapped in what appeared to be pages torn from an old Bible, verses about love and redemption visible even through the makeshift covering. Her hands, small and dirt-stained despite her obvious efforts to clean them, trembled slightly as she began to unwrap her mysterious gift, and Marcus found himself holding his breath as if the next few moments would determine the trajectory of the rest of his life. The object that emerged from the biblical wrapping was so unexpected, so impossible, that Marcus felt his knees buckle and had to grip the back of the pew to keep from collapsing entirely. It was a photograph, faded and creased from years of handling, showing a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile standing beside a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. But it wasn't just any photograph. It was the last picture ever taken of Marcus and his mother together, snapped by a neighbor just weeks before Sarah Wellington's final trip to the hospital from which she would never return. "This belonged to your mama," Elena said softly, her voice barely audible above the thundering of Marcus's heartbeat in his ears. "She gave it to my grandmother before she died, along with a letter she wrote for you." Grandma Rosa worked at the hospital back then, cleaning rooms and emptying trash cans that nobody else wanted to touch. Your mama knew she was going to heaven soon, and she was worried about what would happen to the boy in the picture. She made Grandma promise to find you someday and give you these things, but you disappeared after the funeral, and nobody knew where you had gone. Marcus's vision blurred as tears he hadn't shed in 25 years began to stream down his cheeks, each drop carrying away another layer of the protective shell he had built around his heart. In the photograph, his mother looked exactly as he remembered her, beautiful despite the poverty that had marked their lives, radiant with a love that no amount of suffering could diminish. And there beside her stood a version of himself that he had almost forgotten existed. A little boy with hope in his eyes and trust in his smile, someone who still believed that the world was fundamentally good and that love could conquer any obstacle. "Grandma Rosa searched for you for years," Elena continued, her small hand reaching out to gently touch his trembling fingers. "She went to all the shelters, talked to social workers, even hired a detective with her cleaning lady wages when she saved up enough money. But you had become someone else by then, someone with a different name and a different life. It wasn't until she saw your picture in the newspaper last month, something about a big business deal you made, that she realized the sad boy from the hospital had grown up to be the sad man in the expensive suits." The church seemed to spin around Marcus as the full magnitude of this revelation sank into his consciousness. Rosa Mendez, the elderly cleaning woman who had sometimes smiled at him during those terrible weeks when his mother was dying, she had been carrying this burden all these years, honoring a promise made to a woman who had nothing left to give except her faith in human goodness. The photograph felt impossibly heavy in his hands, weighted not just with memory, but with the love of two women who had believed in something better than the cruel indifference that had shaped his adult life. "Grandma Rosa got sick last month," Elena continued, her voice now thick with unshed tears of her own. "Cancer, just like your mama. She's in the same hospital where they both worked, where she met your mama all those years ago. She can't talk much anymore, but she made me promise to find you and give you this. She said your mama's spirit has been waiting all this time for a boy to come home, and that she could feel it in the halls of that place, still hoping and still loving, even after all these years. Marcus looked up from the photograph to find Elena watching him with an expression of infinite compassion. This child, who had somehow inherited not just his mother's final message, but also her ability to see straight through to the wounded soul that hid behind his walls of wealth and power. In her eyes, he saw the same unconditional love that Sarah Wellington had given him during their brief time together. The same faith in human redemption that he had spent decades trying to convince himself was nothing more than naive foolishness. "There's more," Elena whispered, reaching once again into her backpack to withdraw an envelope that was yellowed with age and sealed with wax that bore the impression of a small cross. "Your mama wrote you a letter. Grandma Rosa said you should read it when you were ready to remember who you used to be, before the world taught you to stop believing in love. She said you'd know when that time came, because you'd start crying again. Not the angry tears of a man who's lost everything, but the hopeful tears of a boy who's ready to find his way back home." The envelope felt warm in Marcus's hands, as if it had been infused with the love that had inspired its creation. Around them, the church maintained its ancient silence, a sanctuary where countless souls had come seeking forgiveness, redemption, and the courage to begin again. For the first time in decades, Marcus Wellington understood why people turned to faith in their darkest moments. It wasn't weakness, as he had always believed, but the ultimate act of strength, the willingness to remain open to love even when every experience suggested that hope was just another word for disappointment. With trembling hands that belonged more to the frightened boy in the photograph than to the powerful businessman he had become, Marcus carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter his mother had written during her final days. The paper was delicate with age, and her handwriting, once so familiar that he could have recognized it in his sleep, wavered slightly from the medication and weakness that had marked her last weeks. But her words, when he began to read them aloud in a voice choked with emotion, carried all the strength and love that had defined Sarah Wellington's too brief life. "My dearest Marcus," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then Rosa has kept her promise, and you have grown into the man I always knew you could become. I know that my leaving you will hurt in ways that seem impossible to survive, and I know that the world will try to teach you that love is weakness, and that caring for others will only bring you pain. But I need you to remember something that I learned during our hardest times together. The strongest people are not those who never fall down, but those who get back up and help others do the same." Marcus paused, unable to continue as sobs racked his body with an intensity that 25 years of suppressed grief had only magnified. Elena moved closer on the wooden pew, her small hand finding his larger one and holding it with the same gentle strength that his mother had once provided during thunderstorms and nightmares. The child said nothing, simply offered her presence as an anchor while the storm of his emotions raged around them both. "I know you will be angry at God for taking me away from you." The letter continued when Marcus found the strength to read on, "and I know you will want to build walls around your heart so that you never have to feel this kind of pain again. But Marcus, my beautiful boy, those walls will also keep out all the joy and love that makes life worth living. Promise me that you will keep your heart open, even when it hurts. Promise me that you will remember that every person you meet is someone's precious child, deserving of the same love and compassion that I have always felt for you." The words hit him like a revelation, illuminating the path he had taken and showing him, with devastating clarity, how far he had strayed from the man his mother had hoped he would become. Every ruthless business decision, every moment of calculated cruelty, every time he had walked past someone in need, they had all been betrayals of her memory, violations of the promise he had made at her bedside, but had forgotten in his desperate quest for invulnerability. "I am leaving you something more valuable than money or property," Sarah Wellington had written in her final paragraph. "I am leaving you the knowledge that you are loved completely and unconditionally, not for what you achieve or accumulate, but simply for who you are. That love will never die, Marcus. It will be with you in every act of kindness you show to others, in every moment of compassion you offer to those who are struggling, in every time you choose to see the light in someone's eyes instead of the darkness in their circumstances. This is your inheritance, my son. Not wealth that can be stolen or possessions that can be destroyed, but love that grows stronger every time you give it away. Elena watched silently as Marcus folded the letter with reverent care, his transformation visible in the way his shoulders had lost their rigid posture, and his eyes had regained some measure of the warmth that had been photographed there so many years before. When he finally looked at her, she saw not the cold businessman who had dismissed her on the street corner, but the lost boy who had been hiding behind that mask all along. "Your grandmother," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "Is she?" "She's waiting," Elena replied with a smile that seemed to light up the entire church. "She always said she couldn't go to heaven until she kept her promise to your mama. The doctors say she doesn't have much time left, but Grandma Rosa is stubborn. She says God will let her stay long enough to see the boy from the photograph remember how to love again." Marcus stood slowly, the letter and photograph clutched against his chest like talismans of redemption. For the first time in decades, he knew exactly where he needed to be and what he needed to do. The hospital where his mother had died, where Rosa Mendez had worked for 40 years cleaning up after other people's pain, where two women who had never met before his mother's final days had formed a bond strong enough to change the trajectory of his entire life. As they walked together toward the church doors, Elena slipped her small hand into his larger one, and Marcus felt something that had been frozen inside him for 25 years finally begin to thaw. Tomorrow, he would begin the long process of rebuilding his life on the foundation his mother had tried to give him. He would learn to see the people he had been blind to offer help instead of indifference, to remember that strength came not from the walls we build around our hearts, but from the courage to keep them open despite the pain. But tonight, he had a promise to keep and a woman to thank. Rosa Mendez, who had carried his mother's love across the decades like an eternal flame, waiting for the moment when a lost boy would finally be ready to come home.